Welcome to Anthodish, the show about food, culture, and identity. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Dugnan. In Nigeria, the word chop is used for food and feasting, and to say come chop is an invitation into sharing and community. This is precisely how Ozoz Sokoh's debut cookbook, Chop Chop, Cooking the Food of Nigeria, begins. It is warm, inviting, and open to all of those who are interested in learning about Nigerian cuisine and the role of home cooks in creating the most beloved classic Nigerian dishes. Ozoz herself is a food explorer, educator, and traveler by plate. She is a professor of food and tourism studies at Centennial College and makes her home with her 3 teenage children in Mississauga, part of the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation in Ontario, Canada. Her work documents and celebrates Nigerian and West African cuisine, and she is particularly fascinated by all the ways that we're similar. Be it through dishes, drinks, material culture, or more, Ozoz explores these across geographies, cultures, and histories, in spite of our apparent differences. In today's conversation, we explore a wide range of the history and future of Nigerian cuisine, including the stories of how ingredients came to be in Nigerian dishes, the homegrown love of protein, and why it's not the relationship to protein that you'd expect from the Western lens, and how Ozoz approaches exploring the histories of recipes and cuisine across Nigeria. Here's my conversation with Ozoz. All right, welcome to the show, Ozoz. How are you doing today?
Good, Sarah. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to chat with you. But before we dig into the deeper discussion today, do you mind sharing a bit about who you are, where you're coming in from today, and the type of work that you do?
Hey, so I am a food explorer, exploration geologist, who now lives in the world of gastronomy, Nigerian, new Canadian, and someone who's really, really interested in food as a bridge, as a way of connection, of joy, of understanding. I live and work in the GTA, but my home is on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and I pay tribute to all of the First Nations and Indigenous peoples who made it possible for me to live, work, and, enjoy my life in the last 5 years of living in Canada. I teach food and tourism studies and generally work in food.
Wonderful. Yeah, it was interesting when I tend to do like a big deep dive before interviewing a guest. And when it came up that you were in geology, to me, it immediately made sense because there's such a deep connection in your writing between like place and land and food and all of those relationships as well.
It's fascinating because I didn't enjoy my 20-year career as a geologist, but I do see the way that certain things that I learned as a geologist play into my work, whether that is an approach of building timelines when I'm working on things and trying to understand what happened first and what the cross connections are. There's also sensory exploration, looking at a thing. So, when I'd go out on field trips, we would look at the color of rocks. We would try to identify the internal character and what that might mean. We would smell it, sometimes taste it, sometimes feel it. And those are all really strong sensory things that work really well with food. I think I learned to observe things as well, because you can take rock samples home, but you can't take a mountain home. You can't take that general broad overview. And so while I was out in the field, I learned to kind of observe things. And I feel like that really helps me with my food.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that. I have a background in archaeology, so similar in terms of how you're approaching time, also licking some rocks here and there. But I want to kind of look at how you come to food, because I very much related in reading through Chop Chop about how you came to food a bit later in your childhood. And I also did. And I don't often see that in cookbook writings. So do you mind sharing a bit about, when food started to become something that was more than just eating to fuel your body for you?
Definitely August of 1985. And the place was Edinburgh. My dad, who's passed now, rest his soul, and my older sister and I went on holiday from Warri on the southern coast of Nigeria to visit my aunt and her husband in Edinburgh. And it was during the annual Edinburgh Fringe Festival and the Military Tattoo Festival. And my life-changing moment happened at Wimpy. And I don't know if you're familiar with Wimpy.
We have the Wimpy's Diners here.
In
I'm not
Canada?
sure if it's... Yeah. I don't know if they're still here, but I remember them as a child with like the big font, like kind of cartoony Wimpy font.
Yes!
Yes.
That was something I didn't know. So Wimpy was very popular in the UK. And yes, and prior to age 9, I didn't eat. And it was a torturous time for my parents because not just the fact that I didn't eat, but I was in and out of hospital, and my parents got a lot of flack. They were blamed and judged for not feeding me. I slipped out of my aunt's hands when I was like 4 or 5 months old because she was trying to feed me and I didn't want to eat. But so there was this aversion to food, and I'm not sure what it was. I feel like I never really got a chance to be hungry. And I say this because I have a daughter, one of my daughters. I kind of saw myself in her when she was young. I didn't really have, I had experience of having one child prior, but I would feed her every 3 hours and her body didn't like it. And even as she grew up, I didn't realize that I should moderate the frequency of which, I was feeding her. Anyways, so I think I just didn't enjoy food at the time. We go to Edinburgh as as you want to do on holiday, we walk a lot. So on this particular day, we had walked up and down Princess Street, done some sightseeing, seen there's a clock in the wall on Princess Street. There's so many things we had done that day. And I feel like for the first time in my life, I worked up an appetite. And so we went to Wimpy, and my dad was like, well, what will you have? And I was like, a kid's meal. So I had a kid's meal, which was a burger, fries, and a drink. Mirinda. And my dad was used to threatening. After he would spend time coaxing and pleading and begging and encouraging me to eat, and then he would be like, get really strict. And on this day, there was none of that.
Okay.
I just, I had the burger, I had the fries, I had the drink, and I was still hungry. So I asked for seconds, and my father was like, what? He was so shocked. He got me seconds, probably shouldn't have, because I had it and I was stuffed and I cried. But that was a turning point. I became open to eating more and being curious about food. And both my parents were really, really good cooks and were really interested in food. And so, from that time on, I kind of started learning and opened up myself to enjoy the things that food could be and do.
Oh, I love that. And it's neat too when you have that kind of definitive moment where, as you said, you're allowed to be hungry and to approach food on your own terms. And then you take that and then you end up running with that through your career.
It's a shock because I would never, ever have thought that I would end up with food as a career, end up in food, but it happened and I'm thrilled. It is my life's work and purpose, and it gives me great joy.
Oh, and you can feel it through your approach, like on social media and in your writing, like through Kitchen Butterfly, through Chop Chop. You can feel how much you enjoy the research process when you're writing or when you're reading your work, rather. So can you speak to what that research process was like in terms of preparing for Chop Chop or even before the cookbook came to be?
So Edinburgh was one huge defining moment in my life. Living in the Netherlands was another one. So I lived in the Netherlands from 2007 up till 2011. And I was working as an exploration geologist. I was an expat, and I was deeply unhappy, but also I think I had a quarter-life crisis because I was working in my company's headquarters. I felt out of my depth for one reason. Kind of liked geology, but not really. I had done geology as a course of study because Nigeria is oil and gas rich, and I was moving abroad. I was moving universities from where I went to university studying urban and regional planning in the southwest of Nigeria to Liverpool in the UK, paying international fees. And my dad was like, you have to study something other than literature, because that was my desire. I wanted to write. And he was like, you can do that on the weekend. And so I was like, okay, well, geology is going to give me a good job. I think I equated having a good job with joy.
Yeah.
And so for the 3 years I was at Liverpool, I did well, but I struggled because I felt out of my depth. I didn't want to be studying geology. I wanted to be doing something else. And I got a job, a really, really good job right after graduation. And so I was in this space of, this is a good money earner. At the time, my partner at the time was a stay-at-home parent. And so we were a one-income family living off the euro with 3 children under 4. And I was overwhelmed. Life was not as reasonably priced as I was used to in Nigeria. I could get help for myself and my family and kids, but it cost a lot. So I was just going through, and then I wasn't really enjoying the work that I was doing. And so I kind of switched and started cooking as a way of finding meaning and stilling myself and calming myself down. And then ended up writing Kitchen Butterfly because I felt like I had metamorphosed. I had gone through these different stages in life. And I remember at the time coming across cookbooks from other parts of the world. I had friends, I lived in an expat community, so I had friends from all over the world. And I was also noticing similarities in culture and cuisine. So I started writing about them on my blog and kind of journaling my experience. And then I remember one day my friend Paula, who's Mexican, telling me about a red rice dish and cooking it for my family and I. And I was like, this reminds me of jollof rice, the red rice dish that exists in many ways across West Africa. And I was like, I could find Mexican books on store shelves, cookbooks. I was like, why are there no Nigerian cookbooks? Why am I even struggling to find Nigerian recipes online? Granted, this was 16 years ago, 2009. And so I started documenting Nigerian recipes. And one particular recipe that I tried to document made me more focused on recipe writing. Is a recipe for akara, which is a bean fritter. And in that recipe, the ratio of water to beans is very important. Get it right and you have fritters that hold. Have too much water and your fritters disintegrate when you go to deep fry them. And that was the very first kind of thing that went off in my brain about recipe writing, particularly in the Nigerian context. So prior to writing Chop Chop, I'd pretty much figured out all of the things that I would put into a cookbook, which was the one dream that I had when I started writing my blog. I was like, I want to write a cookbook of Nigerian cuisine. And so I feel like most of Chop Chop was written before I even settled down in 2019 to write the proposal. I kind of had a sense of some of the things I would go into my book.
Oh, I love that. I love when someone has like the full book in their head before it's even on the page.
In a way, it made things easier, but there were still many moments of struggle, of doubt, of trying to understand things. But I definitely had the seed blooming in my head way before I wrote it.
And I find too, it's such an expansive cookbook where you're looking at so many different regions of Nigeria and all the different ways that different communities could prepare a similar dish. What was that process like in terms of trying to delineate how you're going to tell the story of a particular dish in a particular way?
So in the first draft of the book, which was about 600 pages.
I believe it.
For each recipe, I had every conceivable method, substitute, way of making it, version, name. And my editor, Judy Prey, who deeply appreciated it, said, you will exhaust the reader. A general reader, you will exhaust a general reader. Especially if this is a new cuisine to them. An archaeologist, an anthropologist, someone who has a deep understanding of historical aspects of food may enjoy it, but for the average person. So I had to reframe from a perspective of sharing everything I knew to the versions that had personal meaning for me. Versions that told a story. And it didn't have to be a story beyond the ordinary, beyond the everyday. And so that was the process of getting it down to a workable length, but also being able to communicate what I wanted. I feel like somewhere in the back of my head, there was a scarcity mindset. Like, this might be the only cookbook you'll ever write, so... But also, I'm someone... I felt like that was there. But I'm also someone who I like to empty out my head. And I feel like if it's important to me, it's important to at least one other person. And that person deserves to know so they can kind of fit the pieces together. So, yeah.
I get what you're saying too with the scarcity mindset, because you're also approaching, Nigerian cuisine in a cookbook, and as you said, there's not necessarily, I think it's changed significantly in the last decade, at least in Canada, but you're approaching something and honoring the story of your heritage in a landscape that's marked by a lot of very kind of generic pantry staple Canadian cookbooks that don't necessarily tackle Nigerian cuisine or different cuisines.
Yeah. And it's just many things came together. There was the lifelong dream of writing a cookbook. There was wanting to do Nigerian cuisine justice, empty out my head, making sure that I also created a solid foundation for people to understand the cuisine. And it's unfamiliarity to some, but I tried to kind of put a lot of steps and bricks and bridges that help people connect ingredients, methods, techniques, stories.
Yeah, it's one thing that really stands out in your book is, between the photography and the stories of, particularly looking at how you framed shopping like a Nigerian and the markets, you really brought everything to life for someone in their kitchen. So, can you speak a little bit to how Nigerians approach selling food or buying ingredients and how that shapes the idea of home cooking?
When I was growing up, going to the market, so open air market, farmers market, wet markets, weekly occurrences, we would shop both in the markets where you could buy things in bulk or retail, like you could buy as small as like a cup to as large as sacks or baskets or bushels of things. And so I found myself being up close and personal with ingredients. You could feel, you could touch, you could smell, you could kind of do this visual evaluation before you bought a thing. And there was also the relationship with the seller. But it's interesting because in Nigeria, both the seller and the buyer bear the same name, customer, right? I will have a customer in the market that is someone who I go to buy specific things from. So I'll have a customer who I only buy tomatoes from, or a particular kind of yellow chili or spices. And I will also be the seller's customer. And there's this sense of being able to haggle, being able to bargain. That's part of the ritual and the tradition of shopping, which I enjoy. And so the fact that people could buy things in small quantities or large quantities, I think underpins a lot of Nigerian cooking. You'll find people who cook every day from scratch. And my father, for instance, when he was alive, was someone who didn't eat leftovers. So you would make his soups and his stews and from scratch.
Wow.
Yes, from scratch. And he had very fixed there's certain things that you would do for my dad. So like you would cook for him in a clay pot, and he didn't use seasoning really, just salt and pepper, right? So, and lots of onions. And so there was an approach to cooking for him that was simple and honest, but always delicious, whether it was when he cooked for himself or cooked for us, or when we did it for him. And so I feel like I learned to, one, shop with my parents and also cook with them. And so, just shopping was a mix of markets, but also supermarkets and grocery stores and things like that. A very colorful, multi-sensory journey. So these, like the markets were very, very noisy if you went kind of like at peak. So I learned to shop for ingredients and pick out things and enjoy the process even today of purchasing, of chatting with the seller and kind of sometimes even learning recipes from them.
That's fun. I always love when there's that space to have that. I'm curious to get your opinion in Canada, but I find, outside of farmers markets and sometimes with CSA, sometimes it depends on the drop-offs with CSA farming, but I find that space to have those conversations and to, potentially learn recipes or learn more about the food is a little bit more limited in comparison to what you're sharing.
But I think if I look at like for like, they're similar. If I went to a market in Canada, pretty much like a market in Nigeria, I would find someone to teach me how to do something. But also, I find in particular, the meat and seafood counters, you often can get that kind of support.
Yes.
And maybe even deli counters or counters where there's someone behind the fridge and you can ask and, they can share. Because there are many things that are new to me.
Yeah.
Many ingredients, many things. I'm like, oh, this reminds me of this, but I don't know that I know how to cook it well.
Yeah, that makes sense. I find the deli, like I was a vegetarian for a long time, and so I had to go to the deli stand because I had no idea what to order for my daughter. And so those conversations were what sustained me. Otherwise I would, I had no idea what to call a certain type of meat or how to cook it or prepare it too. So yeah, that's a good observation with that.
It's amazing. So I'm fascinated to understand a little bit more about like how you cooked without, again, probably a lot
Not
of
well.
Did she complain?
Yes, she has a very sophisticated palate for a child. She was very gracious about it, and it wasn't until I got better at cooking it that Mom, the early attempts were a little rough.
That's great. Like, I see a lot of love in that process, whether from you seeking to prep it and help and ensure that she is well fed, and to receiving the feedback and her giving you her thoughts. But also, earlier attempts means that there were several tries. And I think that speaks of hope and possibility. So well done.
Thank you. Yeah, hope is definitely the right word for it. On protein, I wanted to chat with you through that because I know we've had a few conversations about, the particular kind of Western fascination and fixation with putting protein of any sort into confectionery or into other food products. And through Chop Chop, you mention a lot about the love of protein being homegrown and really valued across Nigerian cuisine. So can you speak to this a little bit more and how protein is used and understood in Nigerian cooking?
Yes, Nigerians love protein, and by that I mean meat, but also all parts of the animal. So there's a very sustainable, regenerative mindset about consuming meat. No, like all parts of the animal are privileged. We rarely discard things. And I grew up with that understanding that cow tail or ox tail was as valuable as the flesh of the meat as well. But you also see this protein mindset in the fact that we consume a lot of beans and a variety of legumes in different forms, whether those are fermented as condiments or fermented and added for both protein and texture in a variety of things to meat. And it's interesting the way we eat meat. So a lot of the meat that we consume tends to be in chops. So like little bits, chunks, as opposed to slabs and steaks. And you'll find these typically some tender cuts, some stewing cuts, incorporated and appearing in soups and stews and sauces that are really flavorful. And yeah, meat is also how you would show hospitality. So Nigerian cuisine is incredibly plant forward. But meat is also essential. So a typical example is something like soup, which is stews in Nigeria, but a soup like egusi soup, which is made with melon seeds. In that soup, you might have the flesh of meat, and you might have tripe, you might have kidney, you might have liver, you might have oxtail, and different parts of the animal. And if you served a guest, your pot would be teeming with all of these cuts as a way of inviting them richly to the table. And so, yeah, that's really something that is distinctive about Nigerian cuisine, but also the fact that we mix proteins.
Yeah.
And we do this across land and sea and air. And so you can find a stew which is a tomato-based sauce that is full of beef, goat meat, chicken. And that's not something new or surprising. Like that's a general thing. So there's this mixing of proteins. You might also find sauces that are seasoned with crayfish, dried shrimp or krill, but also are meat-based. And so you kind of get this interaction. And there'll be soups that will have beef and tilapia or catfish as well. So there's definitely that mixing of proteins.
It's interesting because immediately I think about how we approach meat, as you said, like with slabs in North America, and how it's very almost kind of isolated from the rest of the dish. You're not necessarily like, you might have chicken and then potatoes and then a vegetable, but it's not integrated as like a story in the dish. So I'm curious to get your perspective, coming to Canada, seeing how people cook here, seeing how people think about protein here. What have some of your observations been around protein, given how it's honored in Nigeria?
Having also lived in the UK,
yeah,
and in the Netherlands, I wasn't too surprised about the ways that I encountered protein in Canada is somewhat familiar to me, to the extent that I'll go through phases where I crave a steak, but that's like, unlike my son, but he's a teenager.
You're fair.
He dreams of, I'm convinced he dreams of fields and cows, because his love for meat is unreal. But for me, it was just like, oh, interesting. Some of the more surprising things that I found that I've encountered about protein, for instance, is that I imagine that I would have to go to Asian grocery stores, for instance, to get certain cuts of meat or innards and variety meat. But I can go to Metro and I can often find liver and kidney. And I'm like, sorry, what? And I can find gizzards, chicken gizzards. And I think I don't know if they've ever done turkey gizzards, but I can regularly, and I mean like 5 days out of 7, I'll find these things on the store shelves, in the aisles and in the fridge. I'm not used to cooking a whole turkey. I've done it several times in my life. But my daughters, so I have 3 children. One of them is pescatarian. One of them is very particular about the kind of meat that she eats. My son is like the real meat eater, and I'm an occasional meat eater. But I can find things like turkey breast, which I love to prepare during the holidays. It's manageable. There are really only 2 people who'll eat it, and we'll still have enough leftovers for a day or 2 after. And I'm thrilled that I can go to Metro and find turkey breast. But I can also find turkey wings, which I rarely buy, but which are really popular in Nigeria.
Okay. I would have never thought to do that. Yeah.
And so that surprised me, kind of like the grocery stores of today being able to offer me multiple perspectives, both classically Canadian one, but also one that speaks to my Nigerian heritage, and being able to find some of these cuts that I wouldn't have expected to find in a grocery store.
That's good. That makes me also feel hopeful, because I grew up in a very small town. And when
In Canada,
yeah. In Peterborough. It's not that small, but as my husband says.
Isn't the that's kind of like the Kawarthas region, no?
Yes. No, so it's not super small, but small enough that, even trying to find miso to make a dish up until 5 years ago was tricky. Even 5 years ago it was tricky. So seeing
but could you find Thai fish sauce at that time?
Only that like Thai kitchen one. Yeah. But it's starting, like, seeing how it expands even in small towns where it wasn't necessarily reflective of like immigrant populations coming in. And I think it's catching up now, which again makes me feel hopeful that people can have those multifaceted experiences and not just be, stuck with Worcestershire. I can't ever say it.
Worcestershire. Yes, yes,
That
yes.
one.
It's a
Yeah.
tricky one.
I wanted to talk a bit about, you had this really powerful line in Chop Chop when you're looking at how you're approaching ingredients, and you speak to this idea that you want to have a reminder of how ingredients came to Nigerian dishes. And I think you do a really beautiful job of covering, the deeply disruptive ways that certain ingredients come into the dishes, as well as some of the indigenous histories and planting strategies that inform Nigerian cooking more broadly. So can you talk a little bit about the considerations that you brought into building these histories of ingredients through your recipes?
Grew up a certain way with Nigerian cuisine. My mom cooking one way, my dad cooking another way. And there were mixes both of indigenous Nigerian methods and techniques and more British inspired colonial shaped ones. And I didn't start off my food journey thinking about colonialism and its impact on a culture and cuisine. That came years later when I would go to a grocery store in Nigeria and not be able to find Nigerian grown rice that I had grown up with, that I was raised with, and that I had a very strong scent connection with. Like my memory of eating a particular kind of rice from the southeast of Nigeria, abakaliki rice, is this incredibly sweet aroma. The further I went in my food journey, the more anthropology, history became important. And it was like understanding that there'd been fundamental changes in the things that we grew as a result of colonialism, fundamental changes in the ingredients we found on the grocery store shelves, because many of those, so for instance, millet and sorghum, which were the precursors and kind of the grains and cereals you had before corn came, just having them in my childhood, I feel like that was the tail end of them being really prominent, and then having only corn, right? So I started recognizing the fact that the diversity I was seeing had changed, and I wanted to document that journey. Food history is something in Nigeria that is documented in journals and papers, but it isn't at the fingertips of people. There's the modern, now history, the young history, the short history that people know, but connecting that to to the long history and to themes that have endured and things that have shaped what we eat, what we drink, and largely our health, when really seen. And for me, it was very important to talk about the origins and to understand how things like eggs, today, everyday things, but how eggs came to culture and cuisine. And it reminded me of what Anna Ansari writes in her book Silk Roads about how animals that exist now across the world were a result of trade, but in some ways colonialism, and things that we consider everyday now weren't always. I felt like that was really important for me to show Nigerians that even in the regular, there's stories about how they came to be, and we should pay attention to those.
Yeah, the eggs in particular, the way that you had positioned it from like a cooking experience, it's such a moment of meditation to remember what ingredients you're using and how they came to your kitchen. And I think quite often, I mean, especially I'm speaking for myself here, but when you're cooking, sometimes in a weekday, you're just trying to like get through creating a meal and feeding a family and rushing through a day, and to have those moments of, as you said, reminders that this daily experience, there's a depth to it, there's a history, there's a reason that that's here. Yeah, I just thought it was brilliant, and I haven't seen that done that way before.
Thank you so much. You know what? I talk about food. Food has been my salvation in many ways, from my quarter-life crisis to giving me a space of meaning and purpose. And I'm eternally grateful for that. And also the fact that it's never ending.
Yeah.
There's always something to learn, something to journey on, and I'm truly, 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 truly grateful for that.
Yeah, I am too. I mean, I learn everything. I learn so much every day with this as well. I wanted to mention something before I forget, because I had a bit of a chuckle. You have a recipe, like speaking about the impact of like colonialism and how that carries out across different cultures, foodways. You have this recipe for rock biscuits in your cookbook. And so my grandparents are from Ireland, and when they came, to Canada, they didn't really bring much of their food heritage over. But I heard these stories of my Nana making something called concrete cookies. And all the siblings would just laugh in hysterics because they couldn't eat these cookies without dunking it in tea. And she's passed about 10 years now. So I never got the recipe from her. But when I saw that in your book, I was immediately taken aback. And I was like, I think this is really similar to the concrete cookies that we talk about all the time.
That's so amazing. And
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'm obsessed with exploring foodways connections. I'm actually building an atlas that explores these connections. And I have a little prototype on my Feaster Freak website, and I can share that with you. But it's this map-based exploration of food connections. And I have never come across like rock buns, rock biscuits described as concrete, but it makes sense, right? I can, and now I'm going to, in the next year to kind of delve deeper and research and try to find more about these. So thank you for sharing that. And I hope that there is some connection and it brings back some of the joy of being with your grandparents and family.
Hugely so. Yeah. I'm going to try bringing them to some family members for our next reunion and just see if it sparks any conversations too. So I appreciate you sharing that recipe in the cookbook, because that was just such a beautiful a moment of connection, as you said. Last kind of big question for you. I caught you in the new Locals Welcome show, the first episode on Nigerian food in the GTA. And I'm curious, in your book, you mentioned centering legacy and celebration and broadening the definition of global. So thinking about, Nigerian culinary practices in the GTA, I'm wondering if you can speak a bit to how these sorts of legacies are playing out through the GTA and what it has to offer as well.
When I first came to Canada, I moved here in January of 2020. Interesting times. But times had changed my life. And you could find Nigerian food by chatting to friends. Oh, where can I get this cooked dish? And, you could order things off Instagram. 5 years on, there are so many restaurants that have weathered a variety of storms and that are present. And so from having dedicated spaces, dining experiences that are speaking to Nigerian culture and cuisine, whether that's restaurants or supper clubs. I have a very good friend. His name is Fumi, a chef FT, and he runs this Nigerian-inspired supper clubs, small groups for people at his home, and he explores and interprets Nigerian cuisine through his lens of having lived a major part of his life also in Canada as well as Nigeria. And so you see all these kind of pillars. And then you also find a lot of Nigerian ingredients in grocery stores, markets, and spaces that aren't uniquely Nigerian. So there are many African stores, there are many Afro-Caribbean stores that I can go to for majority of my ingredients, but I can also go to a Polish shop to find smoked mackerel and to find the long red peppers that are used, that the Hungarians and the Polish use a lot for paprika and other things. I can go to an Indian shop for my fresh lemongrass leaves, which we use in a lot of Nigerian soups and broths. I can go to a Chinese store or a South Asian store to find a variety of herbs and leaves, like banana leaves or similar leaves for wrapping foods. And so I've also found while there's a very core network and kind of web of Nigerian, African, Caribbean spaces, there are also other culturally adjacent cuisines that I could also explore to get my Nigerian, to soothe my soul with regards to shopping for Nigerian food, but also largely informed how I cooked and tested recipes for chop chop while living in the GTA.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'd imagine depending on when you wrote it, to acquiring different ingredients during the COVID period was a bit of a challenge to navigate.
Thankfully, the majority of things that I did book-wise, so I started writing my book proposal in 2019. my friend James Ransom, who did the photography, an incredible photographer.
Gorgeous.
Thank you so much. And also the team, the Canadian team that I worked with who did the food styling and the prop styling. So that's Lindsay and Andrea, and just kind of working with them to figure out where to get things as well. But that happened later. So by that time, all of the pandemic restrictions were pretty much gone. And so, we could venture out. The early process of 2020, 2021 and writing the book was more about the framing and figuring out kind of like the table of contents and all of the things that were going to go into it and all.
Oh, good. I'm relieved to hear that, because it's such a, you can tell just how much rigor and thought and joy went into the creation of Chop Chop. It's one of those books that feels so welcoming and so delightful in how you're exploring and putting pieces together. So I really enjoyed reading it. I love chatting with you more about the background of it. Do you mind sharing where people can find you online if they want to follow along and learn more about what you're doing?
First of all, thank you for having me on, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Anytime.
It's been delightful to speak with you. So you can find me at Kitchen Butterfly on Instagram. I have a blog by the same name. You can also find me by my first and last name, Ozoz Sokoh, so OZOZSOKOH.com. You'll also find some of my work on Feast Afrique, and Afrique spelled AFRIQ. You'll find an open source library of books that relate to West African and African American history and culinary culture from the 1800s to date, and a few other things. So those are some places that you might find me. I love Instagram, so I hang out there often. I know that it's complicated, but
there's some fun tomato parties happening on your page right now too.
I love it as a place to quickly share current thoughts, explorations, and to connect with people who might be, exploring and experiencing similar joys and delights in food, whether that's seasonal things like tomatoes or other things.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ozoz. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sarah.
That was Ozoz Sokoh. I've linked her book Chop Chop and social media in the show notes below if you want to follow along and learn more. You can also find all this at our website at anthodish.com under episodes. Thanks so much for listening to Anthodish Podcast. Subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out. For more Anthodish, sign up for my newsletter at sarahduignan.substack.com or find me on TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook at Anthodish Podcast. I always love hearing from you and what you're thinking about food. Music production was done by Lucas Wojcicki at lucassound.com. Anthodish is produced in partnership with the American Anthropological Association. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next week.